This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and today our guest is James Loeffler, who is a Felix Posen Professor of Modern Jewish History at Johns Hopkins University and a Kogod Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He writes widely on modern Jewish history from Antisemitism to Zionism, with a focus on the overlooked ties between the Jewish past and the global presence in politics, law, and culture. Anti-Semitism in the United States, from the 1940s anti-Jewish riots to the Nazi March in Skokie, Illinois, to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, has long been on the front line of our wars over freedom of speech and the nature of American liberalism. In his book, Exceptional Hatred, Anti-Semitism and the Fight Over Free Speech in Modern America, James, a leading Jewish historian and Johns Hopkins professor, offers a revelatory exploration of the idea and a critical perspective on today's debates over anti-Semitism and racism, free speech, and hate speech. So, James, welcome to the program. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
So give us a little context. We obviously just read a bio, but give us a little context as far as, where you grew up, kind of how you got interested in this and how you became really one of the leading authorities in the nation on this topic.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm from Washington, D.C., actually. I grew up there and came up in the 80s and 90s. And I was interested at that time in the fact that the Cold War was ending. And we could suddenly know so much more about what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, as we called it, right? As a Jewish person interested in the Jewish past, and as you said in the bio, how it connects to a lot of other stories in our world, I wanted to know what we couldn't know before, which was what really happened to people when the archives opened up. So I started off in that direction, and I also felt like it was a time of great optimism, right? There was a lot of sense of the world coming closer. There was more of a sense of the possibility of peace in the Middle East. And I wanted to tell stories about that to help enrich our understanding and fill in the gaps. So times change and we change, right? And so I also became aware that anti-Semitism was not a problem of the past, that there are ongoing, major polarized divides about this topic, but also real threats. And so eventually that took me to the topic of what can we do to stop it? Right? What are the ways in which law can stop this hate or any hate without ruining our civil liberties, without kind of undermining, our Constitution and who we really are as a society? So that's a topic I was researching for many years as a historian, as a scholar. And then things got even more personal for me because I was teaching at the University of Virginia in 2017 when there was the Unite the Right rally, extremism flared. Violence, death, and then a lot of confusion, because anti-Semitism is something we hear a lot about. Jewish and non-Jewish people, we're familiar with the Holocaust and things like that, but we don't necessarily always have an easy time talking about it or knowing how to relate it to the other stories with which we're so familiar, the story of slavery and debates about how to end racism. And that was manifest to me in that moment. So long story short, I came to this topic after having studied many aspects of Jewish history and never thinking actually I would end up studying something so close to home and so American. But it seemed to demand more attention. That's why I wanted to write this book and really dive deeper.
And you were actually asked to be an expert witness in the trial of Charlottesville, right? And there was something that you were asked to do or what they wanted you to do, and you just said, no, I'm not going to do that. So explain that story a little bit.
Well, I did and I didn't. Yeah, it's an interesting story. Charlottesville, afterwards the question about where was justice going to come for the people who were injured and the family of somebody who was killed. There's also two Virginia State troopers who died as a result of their work in the line of duty there. So there were a bunch of trials. There was one trial, big trial, which I attended and wrote about as a journalist, about the leaders of that Unite the Right rally, the people who were sued as a civil process by people who said you've really damaged us and violated our rights. Then I was personally approached by a prosecutor in Virginia a couple years after that to say, would you testify in a hate crimes trial? And that was an interesting experience for me because, as you can tell from what I'm talking about, I'm used to being on the other side of things as a scholar, right, as a historian, as a writer, much more analyzing the past, how we got here, as opposed to being an expert. And I did that one trial, and it was a challenging but rewarding experience to be able to speak very precisely about my expert knowledge of a matter in a very heated, difficult instance, right, with a guy who was part of a mob and with victims who felt their lives were in danger because of him. So I learned a lot about that. Subsequent to that, I was asked to do another expert witness gig, and that one I declined. That was after October 7th, and that was in a different case in which somebody was suing the university I no longer worked at. But it felt like it was a very fraught, politicized thing, as many of our debates about free speech are these days. And that was a hard decision, I think, as a leader. We're primed to want to engage, share my knowledge. I want to be helpful, I want to be constructive, I want to be dispassionate and fair about these things. But there are also moments when you're not the right person for it. Because you're not going to be able to give what everybody needs in that moment, and also sometimes it's a landmine you don't need to step on.
Yeah, for sure. So those that are watching this on video, I'm holding up the book right now. This is your most recent book,
Yes.
called Exceptional Hatred, and you are a historian, so there's just great stories in here, great learning opportunities for those of us who don't study it as much, and you talk about these events and kind of the details. So we are going to dive into that a little bit as far as the historical stuff, but I also want to bring this back to the leadership piece. Like, how do we deal with this information, and how do we facilitate or maybe maneuver some of these, sensitive issues in the workplace and other areas that maybe we don't have as much experience or history as others do. And so I think that's a delicate walk sometimes that, we need to talk about and be aware of. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
Absolutely.
in the book you talk about, Jews have really ambiguous place in America. That they're demonized as non-white by racists, yet, unrecognized by anti-racists as a minority deserving full solidarity. So you just get in this almost no man's land where, you're this and you're that and you're neither. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a theme that's really striking. And I think it's, look, we've got a lot of confusion about, where Jews fit in. A lot of people say, well, it's a religion. We understand there's Christianity, Islam, and then there are other people who say, well, it's an ethnicity. That's a group that they come from somewhere in the world. They got ties to Israel. I think there's a lot of confusion, and that confusion is because it's a complex community that has elements of religion, faith, as well as ethnic and cultural dimensions. But that also means that everybody fixates on it. And I think one of the arguments I've come to make in my work is that anti-Semitism in particular flares up in moments of great division in societies, when there is great conspiracy thinking, but also just great debates about things like migration and national identity and citizenship. And because Jews are a little bit falling in between the cracks or across different lines of what we think about as a race, as a religion, as a nationality, all that, they become perfect symbols. That was driven home to me in Charlottesville, in 2017, when you got these white supremacists chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And a lot of people said, what does this have to do with Confederate statues, right? What does this have to do with the deep divisions and debates about American identity and about migration and race? Why are they talking about Jews, right? Jews are a tiny percentage of the American population. They may be visible, they may be prominent, but very few people actually are Jewish. So why? And that set me off in trying to understand this, and I wanted to make the public aware of kind of the multiplier effect sometimes that anti-Semitism has, it being this ultimate explainer of a secret power, which can explain some of its appeal to people and why people reach for it in different places, parts of the political spectrum, when they want to kind of have an easy way to figure out what's going wrong by focusing on the group that doesn't seem to fit.
It's interesting in a personal story. I was working with a woman who was a Jewish American, and she came to work with us, and we just loved her, and she was just, so part of the family. And I asked her once, what's your ethnicity? Or, what's your ethnic background? And she said Jewish. And it caught me off guard a little bit because I thought, well, but what country, and then she
Yeah,
said, well, Poland, but her
yeah,
first response was Jewish.
yeah,
So, I think that's interesting to identify that way, which is she felt very strong about.
yeah. And I think that's a look at. We're all complex people, right? And I think one of the great virtues of America is our diversity, right? And the way in which we share a common identity, even if we have a lot of different languages and backgrounds and things like that. And Jewishness is one version of that. And I think that's why you see these great debates we're having today, right? About what can law do to stop hatred, the debates in our politics about Israel and how it connects to Jewish Americans. Even without getting into the nitty gritty of that, I think it is about questions of identity
Yeah,
and people, how people see themselves.
yeah. And when I guess the big question is, when does free speech and hateful discrimination begin? I mean,
Yeah,
it's such a I think to most people, it's kind of like, geez, why does this have to be so polarized that way and so harsh? But yet we all know it's there. I mean,
yeah,
I would say that most Americans or non-Jewish people that were watching the Charlottesville thing were just shocked. I mean,
yeah,
it was like, oh my God, does this actually happen in America?
yeah.
And you of the Jewish faith know it happens all the time.
Right.
So it was just kind of like, oh my God, I think that was just a shocking display of all out, racism and discrimination and all the things that we call it.
Yeah, I mean, it was shocking to a lot of Jewish people too, right? Because this is not part of our common story. We often think about that as that's a story from other places. That's a story of the Middle East, right? That's a story of the Holocaust. That's a story we don't associate here. But those problems persist, and from the perspective of leadership, I do think one of the challenges is how to get people to think this is important to confront rather than something that's just going to divide us and lead us to finger pointing, right? We have
Yeah.
the same problem with a lot of sensitive issues involving minority groups, but I do believe that it's the leadership challenge to say we're going to learn this history, we're going to grapple with these hard questions, and that's going to make us stronger and better equipped to deal with these problems when they flare up.
And I think we just have to look at other people's perspectives. Like in the book, you talk about the story of a Jewish student who's living on, I think they call it the square, and this,
Mhm.
or the quad, I can't remember what it's called, but this group walking right by where she lived with these flaming torches, yelling things. And I mean, she was actually afraid for her life and had friends whisk her out the back door and into a car and get out of here type of thing. And, um,
Yeah,
it's very real fear.
it's very real fear. Yeah, I think there's a one of the things that's you know one of the maladies of our culture, if you will, is that we recognize our fear, but it's harder for us to recognize other people's fear.
Yeah.
And there's a tendency, especially when these things, merge into political debates, whether it's about free speech or whether it's about war. There's a tendency to say, what you're talking about is just a political position, as opposed to no, actually, there's danger here, right? And there's fear that we got to recognize because it's a real component of people's lives, and I think our democracy's goal is to make people free from fear as well as free to pursue themselves and develop themselves.
And just being able to appreciate someone else's perception of an event. During the Black Lives Matter thing that was going on, I can
Mm.
remember, we all learned a lot during that too. And I was talking to a friend of mine, African American person, and I'm a baby boomer, so I can remember telling stories like when we were kids and a police car came into our neighborhood. We all thought it was awesome, and we'd run up and say, "Hey, the cop!" And he said in his neighborhood, when the cops came around the corner, they were all scared to death and ran. So it's just,
Yeah.
it's a different perspective that, you have to appreciate from where you come from and the experiences you've had. You may look at things very, very differently.
Yeah. No, I agree completely, and I think um, our ability to do that is a strength, right? The more we can do that, it's not going to weaken us. It's going to give us the
Yeah.
power of empathy, but it's also going to give us more perspective on how to live together.
One of the big historical things you talk about in the book was Bess Meyerson, who
Yeah.
was the first Miss America winner, and this is 1945, I believe, or something like
Yes.
that. And she won, although she was Jewish, and a lot of people didn't like that and tried to not make that happen because Miss America, they just saw that as a conflict, which. Again, in today's world, that seems crazy, but 1945 was not that long ago.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in telling a story like this is a story about anti-Semitism, about law, politics, but it's also about the wacky ways in which popular culture, right, and the rest of society intersect with it. So Brett Meyerson is a great example of that. I mean, in 1945. America is just wars ending that fall, right? And it's a great victory for her and for many Jewish Americans. They feel like we finally. It's one thing to say, "Oh, you guys are, great scientists. We like, what you do in the world. We respect your culture or your religion." It's another thing when you say, "We think you're attractive too." And I
Yeah.
think that was a breakthrough moment, even though that she faced some opposition. If people said, "No, come on, it's she's too other, she's too much of a minority, she's an immigrant, she doesn't fit the profile." So I open with that story because it tells you something about like the power of images, right?
Yeah.
As much as we talk about equality and civil rights and law, it's also about the images out there, right? That we're always trying to figure out. And now we live in a world with even more images flooding towards us.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then you also tell the story of, I believe his name is Aaron Beinman in Chicago in the late 19, was it 40s or 50s,
Yeah.
where in Chicago, where, I mean, he was absolutely harassed by gangs and mobs and, destroy property and threaten his family. And I mean, that stuff still happens today, unfortunately, but it was just so stark that it would happen in a big major city like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things I wanted to show in talking about his story was um, this goes back to that issue about not every community, not every group looks the same or experiences the same reality. For a lot of Chicagoans at that point, he's a white guy, right? He's a white guy, and he's okay. Maybe he's a minority, this and that. He's Jewish. But in other contexts, when the mob comes and there's deep racism and anti-Semitism, suddenly they're shouting at him, "You're not white. You don't belong," and we want to chase him out. So I think that can tell us something again about sort of hatred. How hatred, it can be irrational, but also can kind of shuffle the categories of who is what because of that desire to really create outcasts and scapegoats and demonize people in these inflamed situations.
So when you tell these things from a historical perspective that you do very well in the book, and then you see something like Charlottesville, which
Yeah,
wasn't that long ago,
yeah,
it kind of feels like we're not making much progress. It's
right.
kind of like, are you just defeated or discouraged with that, or do you think we have made good progress? Where are we at?
Okay, so here's the thing I will say to you. I'm an optimist.
Yeah,
I'm a historian, and I devoted my life to a lot of chapters of history which are pretty gruesome. Nevertheless, I'm an optimist because, for starters, one of the things I've observed is a lot of these things are cyclical, right? Things get worse and things get better. So I think sometimes we let the fact that outbursts of hatred and violence recur to mean like that they're eternal, that they never go away. The risk may always be there, but not every period has been equally bad. And so even after Charlottesville, I felt like this is an opportunity for us to address a real, grave challenge, but we can get it right and we can get it better and we can learn from the past, right? So
yeah,
that's why I'm optimistic about this. I actually say, in the way I think about it, that there was a little bit of a missed opportunity. I think between that moment, that was 2017, and 2023 was October 7th, and launch of a war, Israel and Hamas, and then what has expanded in terms of the Middle East and American involvement in this chapter. Right? I basically feel like there was a missed opportunity for a couple of years where we didn't really have a national conversation about this particular kind of hatred, what it was, how it did or didn't relate to politics or Israel and these hot button issues. And people didn't really know how to have it, and some people just didn't want to. And I think that was a missed opportunity, which made things harder. And as we've gotten into the more recent years, where things are so divided, and there's still threats and challenges, but we're in many cases, I believe, afraid of having a conversation.
Yeah,
That's
I would
something.
agree. I think a lot of people are afraid to say some things or say the wrong thing, and we're kind of in this in our society right now where we're so polarized, we're afraid to say something that's going to offend you, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and was it right? So it's easier just not to say anything. But then we all know that if we don't talk it through and we don't learn and we don't risk, making mistakes and learning from that mistake, we don't make any progress.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and I say that also as a college professor, right? There's a lot of things the universities get wrong, for sure. But, at our best, we are places where people can have brave conversations, right? And the most disappointing thing I have seen is not students who are closed-minded. We have those. But it's actually students who are hesitant to get
yeah.
into the conversation because they're nervous. And that's my job, is to make them say, no, 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 we're here to be brave and critical and respectful. We can do this work.
And it almost feels like too, like that racism and those deep-seated feelings, have always been there, but now it seems like people have gotten the okay to come out and say those things publicly, where before society didn't accept that. So it was like, okay, so it's there, but we don't hear about it now. Because, we don't need to make it political, but now somehow we get into this area where, no, it's okay to say that, say what you think, and go for it. And then that inflames those old feelings.
I think that's absolutely true, and it's a cliche to say, but I do think our social media is a big factor because it changed the game, right, of how we share information and opinions, and that's a whole wild west of information. And I think that's been something we've struggled with, right? And it's true on the right and the left, sort of struggling to figure out what to do about that to protect democracy and still allow free expression. But it's intensified it,
Yeah.
and it's also just intensified. It's shortened our attention span and made it harder for us to think deeply about this when we just again are so attuned to the image, the clip that flashes at us, rather than the thoughtful conversation.
And then trying to step out there and do the right thing at all costs. That I thought it was interesting too when you talk about the ACLU, during the Skokie March, where,
Yeah,
they came out and, felt like they needed to support, whatever side, and it cost them half of their membership.
yeah,
So that was a huge risk. But, so
yeah.
sometimes you have to take positions, I guess, that aren't popular, even at big expense.
Right, right. Back in the 1970s, right, with neo Nazis marching through what was then regarded as the largest community of Holocaust survivors in America. And it prompted this great split. I mean, the ACLU, some of their lawyers felt like it's the principle, free speech, right? And others felt like we don't have to take this case, right?
Yeah.
But they went ahead and they won their court victories, but they lost a lot of membership and they went into a kind of a spiral because some people felt like you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to build free speech around those guys, or you could have approached it differently. So that was a powerful moment to think about and think about what risks are worth taking and why we take them.
Yeah. Well, and then you also state in the book too, which I think is interesting, is that radical and religious conflict is kind of inevitable in a modern democracy.
Yeah,
So, it's one of those things where they say democracy is messy and it's complicated and it's complex, and maybe that's just one of those things that, we can't expect that not to go away because it's there. We just maybe perhaps have to just learn how to deal with it.
I think so. And one of the things I've observed is um, we're not only polarized as a society about these issues and what counts as discrimination and what the law can or should do, but taking a step back, and I think this is one of the key themes we learn when we approach this issue through the Jewish thread in the story, is we don't really have a common language anymore. Do we want to use the word diversity, or is that a bad word for some people? Do we want to use the word pluralism? And if we don't have the language we can share, even to argue about what's the best outcome, then we're really in a difficult position. And I think we're passing through a period akin to those other moments I talk about in my research, where we have not figured out what the language is going to be, what it means to talk about a minority, right? That a lot of those things are changing because we're changing as a country demographically, but we haven't really found the language that matches the moment and that resonates widely. And so instead we're arguing over language in ways that really divide us and don't give us even the kind of terms of debate, right? To have a healthy debate and say, this is what we want.
And is it true that, when you look at, I think back on, um, on tribes and
Yep.
groups of people and feeling like belonging, and I think when people get nervous is when the group becomes bigger, like, a big synagogue or a big religious movement or a big, um, that's when people get nervous, but yet why? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of one of those things where the fight or flight kicks in when you're trying to figure out, is that just so instinctual within our body that
Yeah.
we do that, or why do we do that when the numbers get bigger?
Yeah. I mean, we definitely look. We draw comfort, right, and we draw strength and hope from building units of community, right? I don't think that. I think that's natural. I think that's good. When we flee into it, I don't think that's good, right? And I think especially if we're fleeing because we're fearing too much, others are driving us into it. The big challenge is always kind of like what's the biggest unit we can draw, right? And one of the things as a historian it's striking is it may sound strange to say this, we benefited a lot as a society from the Cold War because there were deep divisions about America, about war, about foreign policy, but we had a sense that we were unified because there was the Soviet Union on the other side. And liberals and conservatives could argue about things, but also they could make their arguments in terms of, well, we as an American people facing something outside. And we're in a different period now. We're still are threats to the United States, but we don't have the same sense of who we are standing in the world against, right? And we, in fact, have profound debates about what's the risk level from China, right, or Iran,
Yeah.
or Russia, and without that, we tend to then divide more into saying, well, the enemy is you or them inside our society, right? Cold War had a lot of problems with it too.
Yeah.
I'm not lauding it as a solution to problems, but I think the question is really what's the unit? What does it mean to be American, right? And how do we define who we are and who we're not?
Yeah, and I think the theology and the philosophy comes into view there. Like, it's kind of human nature to think you're right or you want to be right. And if
Yeah,
there's a disagreement on a fact on something where you say, well, this is the way it's supposed to be, and then they say, no, this is the way it's supposed to be, then that causes conflict. You know, I I personally think that sometimes you just have to say, well, I don't really know, so going forward, this is what I believe, and I respect what you believe, but that doesn't mean we have to hate each other or don't like each other. It's
yeah,
just a different way to look at it. So,
yeah. Absolutely. I mean, humility is a hard thing for our society, and we don't always model it well to younger people or to our friends and neighbors and colleagues. But I do think that's really important to be able to say. And again, I say that as someone who's devoted myself to acquiring expert knowledge. It's still really essential to be able to say we don't know yet, or we
yeah,
don't have an answer, or we were wrong, right? And that's the fallibility is really important to research in every field, as well as to doing the kind of writing of history to say, oh, actually, we learned something new about this, right? It didn't go this way. We now know more about the story.
for sure. So let's take this a little bit into the leadership piece that I mentioned earlier
Yeah,
at the start of this. So, when in a workplace or community controversy, touches identity, race, religion, politics, leaders often reach for what we call unity language.
yeah,
And in your book, you kind of suggest that sometimes maybe that's the wrong instinct. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that. So explain that a little bit.
yeah. Look, there's a power to unity language, and I do believe we need to have frames that encompass all of us, and right, and say what we share. The risk with that I've seen in many institutions is that if you don't, first of all, if you don't do it right, you leave out certain groups, right? You speak a language of unity. I saw this a lot in the past few years where campus leaders would say, well, we recognize we have lots of different religious communities on campus. I'm not sure that resonates in the same way for an Arab American kid who says, well, wait a second, it's not about my, it's not about my Muslim, I may be Christian, but it's about something else. Or for a Jewish kid who says, well, wait a second, it's not, I may not be religious, right? I may not be about, my faith. It might actually be about my sense of peoplehood and my attachment to my heritage and my community. So I do think that the unity language can be tricky because it can end up unintentionally occluding or excluding parts of the community. The second thing is, I mean, there are different philosophies about this, right? But I don't think papering over difference with unity language works as well as we think it was. And sometimes people feel it's sort of like imposing a Pollyannish view of what's going on. So I favor language which will still talk about what we share, but e pluribus unum, right? I mean, the idea that we recognize that there are a lot of differences here, and we share something. I think that can be helpful towards making people feel like you're just ignoring this and trying to kind of rush to a kind of very thin layer of a unity that masks deeper divisions.
Yeah, no, I think that I can remember when we were raising our kids, we used to have a thing at the dinner table where we would say, let's celebrate the differences. We don't have to all be the same. We don't have to all be, one for all for one. Sometimes we look at things individually or whatever. So celebrating the differences. And I do think when you try and get everybody, under the same page and say we should all feel exactly the same, that's unrealistic.
Yeah. Yeah. And it goes also to, ideally our institutional leaders are able to encourage people to be a little bit, to be curious, right? And to be open and to be less afraid about saying the wrong thing when they ask, why aren't you working today? Is it a holiday for you? Or, what's going on with this thing? And are you part of that community, right? That kind of thing. It's not easy to do, but if we do that, we help advance towards the kind of common language that can respect how different we are, but really still hold us together rather than dividing us up into just tribalized society.
Right. So another thing you said in the book, I want you to describe this a little bit more, and hopefully
Yeah.
I say these words right because I'm not familiar with these two words.
Yeah.
So you write that we should historicize. How did I say that?
Historicize. Yeah. Yeah.
Historicize
Yeah.
rather than
Pathologize. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
pathologize. So difficult debates. So, what does that look like when an executive is facing a heated disagreement or something in the workplace and their team? What do those two things mean, and how do you do that as a leader to not let it get out of control?
Yeah. I mean, the first one is just we should pause to care about how we got here, right? We should pause to be willing to understand the forces that shaped it or why people might have a very strong, even an erroneous, even a prejudiced view. To give it a history, to explain it isn't to excuse it. And I think that's really important for helping people understand, especially if, as we know in many conflict situations, an outburst, an ignorant statement might be out of pure ignorance, or it might be out of fear or some other undisclosed issue. So I think that's important. And pathologize means let's just not turn it into a disease, right? Let's not turn it into something. People can do hateful things. That doesn't mean we're all living with a virus of hate that we can't get rid of. I think that makes us too passive as leaders, and then it just becomes like we got to throw out the diseased unit, right? Rather than say, okay, we have a breach here. Now we need a repair. So there's a tendency to say that when we confront certain hatreds, especially one like anti-Jewish hatred, right, where it's got like a deep past to it and so many heavy associations with things like the Holocaust, that you just have to immediately say, that's evil, end of conversation. You can denounce it ethically, but then you also have to figure out, okay, how are we going to repair it? What is it going to take to make these employees, these students, these people feel fully equal, secure here? What's it going to take for to make a situation where if different hatred erupts, we're not going to feel this double standard? That kind of thinking is what I'm trying to get at by saying, we should explain it, give it a history, rather than simply say, oh, that's an ugly ancient eruption. End of conversation.
Yeah. And back to the Bess Meyerson story too, you talk about that positive representation,
Yeah.
alone just isn't enough. You need to go deeper. So where do you see that organizations today making that same mistake? Assuming that, if
Yeah.
you have a diverse group and you have a good PR image, that solves all these cultural problems.
Yeah, well, that's something that's it's definitely been noticeable in many places. I work in the education industry, obviously. The efforts to sort of make everything look right, have the right images and faces of diversity, I don't think that has necessarily helped us that much. It breeds cynicism among many people, right? And there are many people who feel like it sort of tries to jerry rig an image of, this is perfect harmony, and if you don't look like this, you're not desirable. But I know also for many people who are members of minority groups, they feel like, well, I'm being tokenized. I'm just being turned into an image. So you got the right picture of this person, and that's supposed to make it feel as if we've addressed all of the questions and we've made this the climate we want it to be. So I think it's kind of a more superficial fix. And if you look back in history, you actually see some of that too, that some of these efforts have been going on for a long time, and they don't always change hearts and minds. Sometimes they backfire, which I think jives with some of the research we do have about kind of diversity training, right? That people are often receptive to learning about other cultures and differences, but when they feel it's compulsory, then they get quite cynical about what are we being forced to or told to think, rather than a kind of genuine curiosity. Let's learn who we actually all are around this table.
I can remember probably a couple of the worst committees or groups I've ever been in were the ones where people put them together by making sure we had a representative from each of these different things, as opposed to who's best to make this decision and move us forward. So again, just trying to be diverse for diverse sake, maybe not necessarily be the best strategy. It's who's best to make this decision and who's best to move us forward. And of course, you want different perspectives, but just by the fact they come from different workplace settings or different this or that doesn't necessarily mean they have the skills to really, put forward to the group.
Yep. I mean, it's a real challenge now, as we see played out daily in the news too, which is if universities skew towards one part of the political spectrum, what do you do about that, right?
Yeah,
And do
yeah.
you say, okay, we got to hire people who represent the other point of view? And that's a repeat of the same challenge of what is creating genuine pluralism. How can we engineer it, and how should we, and whether that carries risks with it also.
And back to the Charlottesville incident again, it exposed that, I don't think that, as we said, most Americans were equipped to see that. And what does that say about the blind spots that we have?
Yeah.
So, as leaders, how do we make sure that there aren't blind spots like that just come out and go, really, this is even a thing?
Yeah.
What do we do to make sure that we are aware of those underlying, issues that are blind spots to some people?
Yeah. I mean, it's self-serving me to say, but I mean, history helps us, right? The more we study history, not just because there's a cliche we learn from the past, but we learn about the realities that still exist in many places, sort of how they've been shaped by deep forces.
Yeah.
I think another thing we learned, and this was true in Charlottesville, is if you listen to the local level, you can learn a lot, right? And there's a tendency sometimes for leaders to say, okay, I get my information, it flows up to me, and then I talk to peers, they tell me about what's going on, I read news, I get trends to follow, or stakeholders come to me and say, this is my concern. But in many cases, and I think with anti-Semitism this is one of them, in spite of the visibility of a lot of the discourse about it, part of the job is just listening to grassroots level communities and saying what's going on in your town or what's going on here that is bubbling up or that you're seeing. A lot of times that can be the fastest source to what is still gestating, still developing as a problem that we can address early before it becomes a focal point and you have, mobs coming in or blow up on the internet. That's hard to do for leaders because that takes a lot more time and attention, right? To just do listening tours when it's not being brought to you through your channels. But I do think, especially with educational institutions, that's really important to really know what's happening on that level rather than to wait until the reports and the complaints reach you.
And hopefully we get to a place where you can admit a mistake or own your own behavior. I
Yeah.
mean, we all say things that, we wish we hadn't. And again, I don't want to make this political, but when, the President of the United States says there's very fine people on both sides of this issue, you know, at some point you just might say, you know what, that wasn't the right thing to say, or,
Yeah.
it wasn't, but that didn't happen. And so that just inflamed the situation.
Yeah, and I think there's a lesson there that applies to both the right and the left, which is there's sometimes there has emerged a tendency to say like, well, we don't criticize our own because why would we give the other side that victory?
Yeah.
And if you rewind the tape and look back at Charlottesville as a leadership exercise, President Trump, I mean, I think it was a moral failure, but it was also a strategic failure. He easily could have simply said, "That's not us. That's not conservatives. That's not my group," right? Yeah. And he could have just disavowed it, and that would have given him the way to argue that I've got a brand of my version of conservatism which can appeal to people. And rather than say, I'm not going to grant them that victory, whoever them is, right? I don't want to play that game. And that's true on the left, too. We've seen that, a reluctance in some quarters to call out anti-Semitism because it's like, well, why would we want to give that over to that side of the spectrum? I don't think that's the right move ethically, but I also think stronger, braver leadership is willingness to say, when you got a problem in your house, you call it out.
Yeah, for sure. You've spent years studying how legal and civic institutions respond to hatred. What separates an institution that responds well in a crisis from one that just responds poorly?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, you know, when you hit crisis, either you're already prepared to handle it or you're not. So crisis preparation is one thing institutions don't do enough of. That's why there's crisis comms, because it's an emergency. I think they're not ready for it. But that goes with the second thing. You need to know your own policies. You need to know your own rules. You need to apply them uniformly. So much of what has happened in the past few years has been made worse by the fact that people were scrambling to say, wait a second, is that allowed or not on this campus? We didn't shut that down, so why are we shutting this down? Or vice versa. We shut that down, don't we have to shut this down? And when people don't know their own rules, then you're not in a good position to sustain trust inside institutions. And a uniform application of our own policies and rules can do a lot, right? I've talked a lot about different ways to think about law and approaches to hate speech, but at a bottom line, consistent application of our rules is what is going to allow us to sustain trust and to be fair, right? So there's so much scrambling I've seen where people say, wait a second, what are we supposed to do about this? And conversely, the institutions I've observed that handled it better were the ones that actually, maybe they'd already been tested by a previous controversy, but they knew what they were prepared to do and what they weren't. They knew what kind of communications they wanted to have with all the stakeholders. And the ones that didn't and sort of closed themselves off were the ones that had the most problems, where people were screaming at them from all sides and saying, why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing that?
And I think too, timing is an issue too, right? Because
Yeah.
if you don't know what to do, then it's like, okay, let's hunker down and figure out what to do. And you take too long to respond, then everyone's like, well, what are you doing? You got to
Yeah.
say something. So
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
not an easy position to be in. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have often argued, and I've written about this, that I think you need to be willing to take a little bit of time in advance to know what controversies are brewing and to think through in advance how you want to handle them. Does this match this scenario? Oh, we dealt with this before with workplace issues. We dealt with this before with, outside groups wanting to engage us or challenge us. I think that investment really pays off. It also helps you grow as an institution. and it breeds confidence from inside, from the people who then may turn out to be your best friend or your worst enemy, right? The
Right.
student, the employee, the colleague who's going to say, okay, I now have faith you're going to handle this, versus the one who says, I've always had a grievance with you, and I don't think you're doing this right. And now I have proof. Now I'm going to turn to really, try and enter conflict with you.
And to be brave enough to maybe realize that you can't make everybody happy, or you
Right.
shouldn't try to make everybody happy. Sometimes you got to make a decision that will be unpopular to some, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more you can do that with transparency, I think the better it is, right? And to
Yeah,
say
yeah,
this
for
this
sure.
is where we are.
So, as a historian, you're trained to sit with this ambiguity and, resist easy narratives and all
Hmm.
that. Is it a leadership skill that can be taught, do you think?
Hmm.
I mean, some people are good at it,
Yeah.
some people aren't. And so,
Yeah.
you think of these leadership development programs that I spent a lot of time doing, it makes me think, can you teach that, or how do you bring that to people's attention that you could be in a situation where this happens and that happens, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I believe, you know, by creed, by constitution, I believe everything can be taught. It's some things are harder than others. Um, it's not easy to do with our leadership model, which wants to get to clarity, right? Wants to get to clear messaging, wants to get to good resolution decision. Sitting with gray can sometimes be a dodge, and sometimes it can be something that leaves everybody unsatisfied and doesn't move you forward. But I think it's also really an essential skill for understanding complexity and then being able to decide how I want to manage it. The way you teach it, I believe, is often through the Rashomon effect, right? When you look at one story and you see how it can be viewed radically differently by people. And hopefully, good historians and good experts in all fields of knowledge can show you how, where the truth is, even as it can be splintered through different, points of reflection. Or the two things can be true at the same time. And then we go back to what we were talking about, which is you might have to make a decision to prioritize one value, but at least you've recognized the other value in the situation.
Yeah,
That to
another
me
way to
is key.
say that is I think in a conflict conversation or situation, I've often, or I learned that you need to go back to the point where you can both agree on something
Mm,
and then
yeah.
start to move forward, because surely there's something that we can agree on. And so if you go
Right.
back to that and say, okay, let's both agree on this. Okay, now we can move forward and look at something else. Whereas if you just start at the powder keg where everything went crazy, it's hard to get anywhere because you're just both so inflamed at that particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and historians as our training to go back to origin points and
Yeah,
baseline.
yeah. So, if there was one lesson from your book that you want leaders and people to hear and go forward with, what would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the lesson is we value free speech and we value civil rights, making people equal and safe. Both things are true. There are going to be conflicts between them, right? And so, a starting point for our conversation is to think about how we want to balance them. Everybody wants free speech, so we race to say that's good, but then we say, wait a second, that's a problem, that's dangerous. So I think our job is, in many cases, to balance equally valid commitments to what it's going to take to keep every citizen equal and protected, as well as free to express themselves. That balancing act is something that is, I think, our big challenge. I don't think it can be addressed in a soundbite. I don't think it can be addressed just through a single, edict or a mantra or a hashtag. But I do think that's going to be an issue going forward because it's not going to end with the challenges we've described in this conversation about anti-Semitism or the Middle East. Right? It's going to continue to be things because we're an extremely diverse, heterogeneous society. With a lot of divides between us, among us, that they're going to continue to force these questions to the surface.
Kind of the conventional wisdom in leading companies and leading teams and whatever has been in the past. Whatever you do, don't talk about politics and don't talk about religion.
Yeah.
Just don't even talk about it. But I wonder, is that part of the problem? I mean, should we be more comfortable with at least discussing those things even in the workplace, or does that just create chaos?
I think we're going to have to be more comfortable because our country's changed and the way people think about religion has changed as
Mhm.
well, right? And this is not just about communities, Muslim communities, and their religiously prescribed dress. I mean, this is also about how people think about, how Christians function in the workplace and school. I think we've changed how we think about these issues, so we're going to have to confront it. A lot of the stuff is moving into court cases and politics, but it often begins inside institutions that have to decide where we're going to place the conversation. And I think it's okay to have that more close to the center of things. I don't think that weakens us. I think it helps us feel more confident that the institution is willing to, go there.
Yeah, another thing you say in the book too is that choices carry consequences, which really are the pride of freedom, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
we can't, we can't try and make everything homogenous. We can't try and make everything, make everybody happy. We make choices, we do things, but that's what freedom is. Otherwise, we turn into this authoritarian, my way or the highway, and this is the way everybody has to do it.
Yeah. The flip side of that is that the choices we make could be applied to us, right? So the script can be flipped, and that's part of what we have to keep in mind, right? What we ask for to deal with the problem that we find most threatening in society, which may be genuinely threatening, has to be something we can live with if it then gets applied to something else, right? That's our great challenge when it comes to especially things like free speech. Making sure we're consistent and being willing to think about something we would ask for or grant, that it's going to be something we can live with across a whole variety of instances.
Mhm. In anticipation of our discussion today, what haven't I asked you or haven't we talked about that you want to be sure and get in the program today?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered so much, and I'm grateful to you for the opportunity to talk about this. Um, I think one thing that we haven't talked too much about is just this question of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
There's so many ways in which the old adage that every conversation goes until somebody calls someone a Nazi, right? And there's so
Yeah.
many ways in American society that we are constantly referring back to that as that would be like that's going to be the proof, that's going to be the stamp, that's going to win my argument, that's why we demonize somebody. I want to suggest, and this is one of the things I think is important for people to consider, that that's probably a less helpful way, even though we know the enormity of the Holocaust. It's not going to help us to solve this problem of anti-Semitism. In America, at least, it's going to have to be solved, and related issues about hatred through talking in American terms about what we are as a society. And I think that may be a subtle point, but I think it's an important one for us to not always race to the past to an event that in the end didn't happen here, and think more about what are the deep traditions, positive and negative, inside America that have affected Jews and other parts of our population. Let's focus on those stories rather than relitigating how bad somebody is vis-a-vis Hitler or the Middle East. I think that will get us further in a conversation as well as understanding.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, at this point in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question, and that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
Yeah, there is nothing better than curiosity. I have consistently found that there's nothing better. People love when leaders are curious about them, and leaders learn by being curious about their team and everybody else. If there's one thing I aspire to cultivate in the next generation of leaders, right, by teaching people on the college level, it's to make them. They're going to be bright. They're going to be ambitious. They're going to be savvy. I want to make them curious, so they know there's still more to learn from people around them. So I think holding on to that, even when it takes more bandwidth and more time, is a really essential skill to keep a hold of.
I couldn't agree more. That was really well said. The word curious, I think that's really what makes great leaders.
Hmm.
Leaders that come in that think they have all the answers and know all the things to do and just, I think the better leader is the person who's curious and wants your opinion and what do you think and how would this work? And well, really, is that what you're thinking? And, get into those conversations because the openness to look at things in a different way and being curious about what could be done, as opposed to, I know it all and this is what has to be done. I think makes a great leader, and hopefully leadership in the future is changing in the way that people are more open to that. The old command and control where I know everything and you do as I say and don't ask any questions. I know that that has changed over the years, and I think we're getting more to the openness of it. But that being curious about what could be, I think, is a huge goal that all leaders should have, and I appreciate you saying that. I think you're right on.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Well, James, this has been a real pleasure. Again, I told you it's an area that I was very interested in, and I wanted to talk about, and feel like we all need to know so much more and appreciate so much more, and look at different perspectives, and not be afraid to talk about it. So I appreciate your time and what you're doing, and bringing the history into it. Definitely gives us some foundation to look at, and see if things have changed. And when we think our world is so horrible and all these terrible things are happening, hopefully it's better than it was. We've learned some things along the way, but it's good to look back and study that as well.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for the chance.
Okay, well, take care and have a good rest of your day.
You as well.
Bye bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.